stop right there. What exactly do you think you're doing?
Officer, is there a problem?
Don't give me that. I've been working this terminal for a month. I know every pilot on staff. That uniform is fake, and you know it.
That uniform has 4 captain stripes. I've earned every single one.
Sure you have. Turn around. You're under arrest.
30 years in the air. Thousands of lives safely delivered. For gold stripes earned on merit alone. None of it was enough to stop a 1-month rookie from putting him in handcuffs. But all of it was exactly why he would have the last word. Here's what happens when a security officer with 4 weeks of experience decides he knows more than a captain with 30 years of flight time. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this story is going to hit different wherever you are. And if you think a man who has safely flown thousands of passengers deserves to walk through his own terminal without being accused of fraud, like this video and subscribe. Denver International Airport on a Tuesday morning in late September was operating at full capacity. Thousands of passengers moved through the terminal in overlapping streams, rolling luggage across polished floors, queuing at ticket counters, filtering through security checkpoints, and pressing toward departure gates for flights that would carry them across the country and around the world. The morning rush had started before dawn and showed no sign of slowing. Terminal B was alive with the low, constant roar of a busy public space, gate announcements echoing from overhead speakers, conversation in a dozen languages, the rhythmic percussion of hard-sided bags on tile. Captain Michael Ray walked through that crowd the way he always did, unhurried, precise, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had been doing this for 3 decades. He was 52 years old. 30 years of flying experience. 9 years as a captain for Skyline Airways, one of the major carriers operating dozens of daily flights out of Denver. His record was what the industry called exceptional, thousands of flight hours logged across every weather pattern and mechanical condition the sky could produce, a safety record without blemish, and a reputation among airline management as one of the most technically skilled and dependable captains in the fleet. Among his peers, he was known for something rarer, the kind of composure under pressure that newer pilots spent careers trying to develop. In the cockpit, his voice never changed. Not during storms, not during system failures, not during the slow emergencies that tested everything a pilot had learned and forgotten and relearned. He wore the standard Skyline Airways captain's uniform, navy blue jacket, 4 gold stripes on each sleeve marking his rank, crisp white shirt, black tie bearing the airline's insignia, black slacks with a sharp crease running clean to the floor. His captain's wings were pinned above the left breast pocket with the precision of a man who had worn them long enough to stop thinking about them. His name tag, Captain M. Ray, sat exactly where it always sat. Nothing about the uniform was approximate. Nothing about the men wearing it looked out of place. He had just returned from a 2-week vacation, the first real break he had allowed himself in over a year. He had spent it quietly, visiting family, recalibrating, giving his mind permission to exist outside the rhythms of pre-flight checklists and weather briefings. He was rested. He was on schedule. His first flight back was departing in less than 2 hours, Flight 247, bound for Seattle, a route he had flown enough times to know by feel. He was heading toward the crew briefing room to begin his pre-flight preparations, moving at the steady pace of a man with somewhere to be and the experience to know how to get there. That was the moment Officer Mark Thomas noticed him. Thomas was 29 years old and had been working as an airport security officer for exactly 1 month. He had been hired as part of a staffing expansion intended to manage increased passenger volume through the terminal, and he had completed the standard onboarding training, threat recognition, emergency response protocols, terminal layout, proper procedures for detaining and verifying personnel. In 4 weeks on the job, he had shadowed senior officers, walked the concourses until he knew the routes, and begun to develop a working familiarity with the rhythms of the airport's daily operations. In that 1 month, Thomas had also developed a confidence that his experience had not earned. He had seen pilots move through the terminal. He had observed flight crews in uniform, noted their gait, their equipment, the way they navigated the space with the practiced ease of people who belonged there. He had seen the same faces cycling through the morning shifts, gate agents, baggage handlers, ground crew. He had told himself he was learning the environment. What he was actually doing was assembling a mental picture built from 4 weeks of observation and mistaking it for expertise. He had never seen Captain Michael Ray before. He had no way of knowing that Ray had been on vacation for the entire duration of his employment. He had no way of knowing the schedule rotations that governed how often any given pilot appeared in any given terminal on any given day. He had no way of knowing any of the things that a more experienced officer would have considered before acting. What he did know, or believed he knew, was that he was looking at a black man in a captain's uniform, and something about it did not sit right with him. The logic that followed was not the product of evidence. It was not the product of training. It was the product of assumption, a series of calculations that began and ended with bias, dressed up as observation. He had been here a month. He knew the pilots. He did not recognize this man. Therefore, the uniform was not real. Thomas stepped away from his post near the Concourse C entrance and moved directly into Captain Ray's path. His stride was purposeful. His expression had already made its decision before his body had finished crossing the floor. He stopped where he stood and blocked the captain's passage, forcing Ray to halt or walk through him, and his voice carried into the surrounding crowd at a volume that was not necessary and was not accidental. The accusation came immediately. The uniform was fake. The credentials were fraudulent. This man was an imposter attempting to pass himself off as a captain, and Thomas, who had been doing this job for 1 month, was the one who had caught him. Captain Michael Ray remained composed. He had felt this before, not always this bluntly, not always in uniform, but the shape of it was familiar. He explained, in the same measured tone he used during instrument approaches in low visibility, that he was a captain with Skyline Airways. That he had been on vacation. That the 2 weeks of his absence corresponded precisely with the 4 weeks of Thomas's employment. That this was why Thomas had not seen him before. Thomas laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound, and what came after it was not dismissive at all. The words he muttered, loud enough for Ray to hear, loud enough for the body camera on his chest to capture with complete clarity, landed in the air between them like something permanent. A black man as a captain. Yeah, right. That's a good one. Passengers nearby had begun to slow. A few had already stopped. Phones were rising. Captain Michael Ray produced his credentials without raising his voice. His Federal Aviation Administration pilot license, a federal document bearing his photograph, his certification class, and his expiration date. His Skyline Airways employee identification, with his captain designation printed clearly. He extended both without comment. Thomas took them. He examined them the way a man examines something he has already decided is wrong, turning them over, studying the photo, looking up at Ray's face as though measuring for discrepancy. What his expression showed was not scrutiny. It was performance. After a long moment, he announced that the documents were fake. That they were well made, but fake. That their quality was simply evidence of how seriously this kind of impersonation was being carried out. Then he reached for his handcuffs. Captain Michael Ray, 52 years old, 30 years of flight experience, 9 years as a Skyline Airways captain, and the only credentialed pilot cleared to command Flight 247 to Seattle in less than 2 hours, stood in the middle of Terminal B with his hands cuffed behind his back and his flight bag on the floor. The passengers around him had stopped moving entirely. The phones kept recording. The gate announcements continued overhead, indifferent. Thomas radioed for backup with the careful pride of someone who had done something significant, unaware that the significance of what he had just done was going to define everything that followed. And what followed was already in motion. The radio call had gone out less than 90 seconds before Chief Security Officer Robert Ellis appeared at the far end of Terminal B, moving through the crowd with the kind of controlled urgency that came from 2 decades of managing crises before they became catastrophes. He was 51 years old, a career airport security professional who had spent the last 10 years at Denver International, and he had seen most of what an airport could produce: medical emergencies, altercations, confused travelers, the occasional genuine security threat. He had developed, over those years, a reliable instinct for reading a scene from a distance before he arrived in it. What he read now stopped him for a fraction of a second before his training pushed him forward again. Captain Michael Ray stood in the middle of Terminal B with his hands cuffed behind his back, his flight bag on the floor beside his feet, and the particular stillness of a man exercising profound self-control in circumstances that did not deserve it. Ellis had known Ray for the better part of 8 years. He knew the uniform. He knew the face. He knew the 4 gold stripes and what they represented in terms of hours logged, examinations passed, and authority earned through the accumulation of irreplaceable experience. The recognition was immediate, and what came with it, the slow, clarifying understanding of what his newest officer had just done, arrived in Ellis's expression as a visible transformation, moving from concern through shock and settling into the cold, contained fury of a senior professional confronting a preventable disaster. He crossed the remaining distance without slowing. Thomas began his explanation before Ellis reached him, the words coming quickly and defensively, layered with justifications that collapsed under their own weight as fast as he produced them. The uniform had looked suspicious. He had not recognized the men. He had been doing his job, applying his training, acting on reasonable concern. He had been protecting the terminal. He had been here a month and he knew the staff, and this man was not someone he had seen before, and the identification had appeared fraudulent. Ellis stopped him. Not loudly. The quiet was worse. What Thomas had not been told, what he had not thought to verify before reaching for his handcuffs, was the operational reality of the flight he had just grounded. Flight 247 to Seattle was not a routine departure in the way Thomas had assumed all departures were routine. The aircraft had undergone significant maintenance work on its primary navigation system in the preceding week, and the post-maintenance certification sign-off required a captain with a specific technical qualification that existed in exactly one personnel file at Skyline Airways' Denver operation. That file belonged to the men currently standing in restraints on the terminal floor. Without Captain Michael Ray's physical presence to complete that sign-off, the aircraft was legally prohibited from pushing back from the gate. 178 passengers, already boarded and seated, were going nowhere. The weight of that information settled over Thomas visibly. His explanation slowed and then stopped. Around them, the crowd had thickened. The passengers who had already been recording continued to do so, their phones held with the quiet steadiness of people who understood they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Others had gathered not because they knew what was happening but because the energy of the scene demanded attention: the handcuffed man in the captain's uniform, the senior officer with iron in his face, the rookie whose confidence had evacuated somewhere between his last sentence and this one. What would you have done if you were standing in that terminal, watching a decorated captain treated like a criminal in his own workplace? Would you have hit record and shared it, or walked on by? Drop your honest answer in the comments. These moments only force change when people refuse to look away. Ellis had already called for the restraints to be removed. The process of undoing what Thomas had done in 5 minutes was going to take considerably longer than 5 minutes, and Ellis understood that with the precision of someone already calculating the institutional cost. As the cuffs came off and Captain Ray retrieved his flight bag from the floor with the unhurried composure of a man who refused to perform distress for an audience, Ellis began the preliminary review that would accelerate everything that followed. The body camera footage was available within the hour. The racist remark, muttered at a volume Thomas had perhaps believed was private, captured at a volume that left no room for interpretation, was there in full, time-stamped and unambiguous. What emerged alongside it, as Ellis pulled Thomas's activity log for his 4 weeks of employment, was a pattern that transformed an incident into a record. 6 reports. All of them filed against airport employees. Every single one targeting a black or Latino worker. No similar reports against anyone else. The pattern was not subtle. It was the kind of pattern that only appears invisible when no one is looking for it, and now someone was. The deeper revelation came when Ellis requested Captain Ray's complete personnel file, not the operational summary, but the full classification record that most of the airport's security staff had no reason to access. What it contained changed the dimensions of the story entirely. Captain Michael Ray was not simply a Skyline Airways captain. He was one of the airline's most trusted check captains, a designation reserved for pilots whose judgment and technical mastery were considered reliable enough to evaluate other pilots. Beyond that, he held an FAA-designated safety evaluator credential that placed him in a small, select group of aviation professionals authorized to conduct official assessments on behalf of the federal regulatory body. For the past year, he had been operating in that capacity in a specific and sensitive program, undercover evaluations of security to airline coordination protocols at major hub airports. The program existed precisely to identify the kind of systemic failure that allowed bias to operate unchecked in environments where the consequences extended beyond hurt feelings and into operational safety. Thomas had not stopped a suspicious imposter. He had handcuffed the men who had been quietly evaluating whether the airport's security culture was safe enough to trust. The passenger videos were already spreading by the time the full picture came into focus. By evening, the story had found the kind of audience that does not let things go quietly. The formal review moved with the methodical momentum of an institution that understood it had no viable alternative to transparency. Chief Ellis spent the better part of that afternoon in his office with the body camera footage running on repeat, not because the content was ambiguous, but because the documentation had to be airtight. The racist remark was there. The pattern of 6 prior reports was there. The refusal to accept valid federal credentials was there. The sequence of events from initial confrontation to restraint took less than 7 minutes from start to finish, and every one of those minutes was recorded from multiple angles by the time passenger footage was factored in alongside the official body camera feed. The case built itself. Thomas was summoned before the end of the business day. The meeting was brief in the way that meetings are brief when the outcome has already been determined by the evidence and the only remaining procedural requirement is notification. His employment was terminated effective immediately. The grounds were specific and documented: racial profiling, failure to follow verification protocols, conduct unbecoming of airport security personnel, and the creation of a hostile environment for a credentialed aviation professional in the lawful performance of his duties. He was escorted from the building by the same senior officers he had spent 4 weeks trying to impress, his access credentials deactivated before he reached the exit, his 1 month of employment ending in the particular silence of a consequence that could not be appealed. The background check implications followed him out the door. The documented racial profiling incident, combined with the pattern established by his activity log, created a professional record that no reputable security or law enforcement agency was willing to absorb. The airport industry communicates through those records with a quiet efficiency that formal blacklists are not required to replicate. Thomas's name became the kind of name that appeared in a background report and ended a conversation before it had properly begun. Captain Michael Ray, meanwhile, completed his pre-flight duties. He was visibly shaken in the way that a person is shaken when public humiliation has been administered with precision and witnessed by dozens, the kind of shaken that does not show in the voice or the hands but lives behind the eyes and in the set of the jaw for a long time after the handcuffs come off. He had been a professional for 30 years. He understood the separation between what he felt and what the 178 passengers on Flight 247 required of him in the next several hours, and he applied that understanding with the same discipline he had applied to everything else in his career. The aircraft pushed back 90 minutes behind schedule. It arrived in Seattle safely, on instrument, under his command, exactly as planned. The lawsuit was filed and settled without going to trial. The figure was $45,000, a number that the airport authorities' legal counsel understood represented the minimum of what a jury might award given the footage, the documented pattern, and the professional stature of the plaintiff, and a number that Captain Ray accepted not because it was adequate but because the litigation itself had already accomplished the part that mattered. He donated the majority of the settlement to a scholarship fund for aspiring black aviators, a quiet redirection of the institution's money toward the pipeline that institutions had historically worked hardest to restrict. In later interviews, he was specific about what had caused the most damage. The restraints had been uncomfortable. The public exposure had been something different entirely, a particular kind of harm that the settlement figure could not convert into something proportionate, and that he had chosen to metabolize into something useful instead. He said the real victory was in the change. Denver International Airport implemented mandatory bias training for all security personnel within 6 months of the incident, not as a voluntary professional development offering but as a condition of continued employment. The training addressed specifically the cognitive shortcuts that had allowed a 4-week employee to believe that unfamiliarity was the same as illegitimacy, and that a credential he couldn't personally verify was therefore fraudulent. Verification protocols were restructured so that no detention of airline personnel could proceed without confirmation from a senior officer. The requirement to personally verify pilot credentials in disputed cases was formalized in writing and incorporated into onboarding documentation so that the next Mark Thomas would encounter the standard before he encountered the terminal. Skyline Airways incorporated the incident into its internal training curriculum. The scenario was not presented as an exceptional case or an aberration. It was presented as an example of what happens when institutional bias goes unaddressed, how quickly it escalates, how operationally catastrophic it becomes, how many people it affects beyond the individual at the center of it. The training was used to demonstrate something specific, that bias does not stay in the human dimension. It grounds aircraft. It strands passengers. It creates liability. It converts the private failure of a single person into a public institutional event. The industry noted all of it. 5 years passed with the steady accumulation that years have when the person moving through them is building something on a foundation that was already deep before anyone was watching. Captain Michael Ray's promotion to Director of Flight Operations for the Western region was announced internally before it became public, and the people who had worked alongside him for the better part of a decade received it as a confirmation rather than a surprise. He had been doing the work of that role in practice long before the title recognized it, the evaluations, the oversight, the quiet standard setting that shapes a culture more durably than any policy document can. He did not speak extensively about the incident. When he did, he was measured and specific, the way he was measured and specific about everything. He said that the afternoon in Terminal B had been one of the most painful professional experiences of his career, not because of the physical restraint but because of the particular message it carried, that 30 years of demonstrated excellence could be erased, in a public space, by 4 weeks of someone else's assumptions. He said he had chosen to let the response outlast the event. Officer Mark Thomas was working night shifts in a warehouse on the outskirts of Denver. His name appeared periodically in coverage of the incident when journalists wrote about racial profiling in airport security contexts, always as the example, never as the lesson. The lesson belonged to everyone else. What the terminal had produced that Tuesday morning in September was not, in the end, a story about a single bad actor. It was a story about what happens when systems fail to interrogate their own assumptions before those assumptions make contact with the real world and the real people moving through it. The man in the captain's uniform had always been exactly who he said he was. The authority had always been there. The credentials had always been legitimate. None of it had required the humiliation to become true. It had been true before the first word was spoken, and it remained true after the last word was written. 30 years of flying. A career built in the quiet space between takeoff and landing, between instrument reading and human judgment, between the difficulty of the work and the discipline required to do it well. A promotion earned on exactly those terms. One racist decision had tried to stop a plane from taking off. The plane had taken off anyway.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.